Speaking of the keynote, it's time. She's here. She's ready. Are you all ready? I am ready and really honored. Margo Downs has had an incredible career in the world of human resources. Most recently, she was the Chief People Officer for Stitch Fix, a fashion technology company. Margo scaled that company from 50 to 7,000 people, taking it from private to public. Prior to that, she was a Chief People Officer for Lululemon from 2010 to 2014. She also worked at Starbucks Coffee Company from 1995 to 2010, and in a number of human resources leadership roles, including Vice President of Global Learning and Development. After leaving Stitch Fix in March of 2019, she has been focusing on consulting with early-stage companies regarding people and culture strategies, as well as speaking and writing on these topics. Margo is excited to share her knowledge and build great companies as the next chapter in her career. When she's not helping founders create great companies, she enjoys movies, cooking, spending time with friends and family, and of course, her two sweet pups, Daphne and Pippa. Margo, please join me on stage. Here we are.
Hello, everybody.
In our own little private cafe.
Oh my goodness.
I know, these are very tall chairs for us.
I know. And I'm wearing real clothes. Being in front of people, not from just the waist up on Zoom, so I actually have like a whole outfit on. So it's a big day.
It is a big day. You look wonderful. It's great to have you here. Thank you.
So does everybody. You look good.
I want to ask you a really important question.
Yes.
So you have two dogs.
I do.
Do you feel like you cracked the code of happiness by getting two dogs? Because I feel like I cracked the code.
Do you have two dogs
I
too?
have two dogs.
Yeah. I actually have to say, too, in honor of Daphne has passed, so I need to update my... But I know, but she's fabulous. A yellow lab, 14, had a beautiful life. But she has been succeeded, so it's like a succession plan in a business. I know, I don't say that to be cold.
I'm familiar.
By a puppy whose name is Aoife, which is a Gaelic name that means beauty.
Okay,
And
so
I do
Pippa
feel like I've cracked the code, because I think this is somehow related to culture, but they have a totally different relationship with each other than they have with me. And it's very sweet. And I also got to meet a lot of people in my neighborhood having dogs during the pandemic, because everybody was outside. So it was like, I live in San Francisco, so that was a really great way of socializing with people.
I love that you related it back to people and culture, because it's so true. Dogs are living in their own world. We think they're living in ours. They're living in their world, and we need to honor that.
Right. We work for them.
Absolutely.
I mean, who has dogs here, right? Do you work for your dog? It's all about pleasing them, especially Daphne. She was the queen of our household. So we just lived for her. That was all we did.
My dogs basically have their own savings account at this point. I mean, so you have just an incredible background in people and culture and some really incredible companies. And I wonder if you might just give us kind of a foundation of your work up to this point.
Oh my goodness. Well, what I first wanted to say was the panel was so good. I honestly feel like I don't know what there is left to say. It was sort of like, well, let's talk about dogs for a half an hour. But no, seriously, I mean, I felt like there were so many really beautiful things that were very unique, and also there's a thread. Gosh, what to say? I guess what I would say, like, I was very fortunate to have worked with 3 companies that actually really believed in creating strong cultures. And so I guess, I mean, I would say early on, and this was actually even before Starbucks. So I worked for a company called The Body Shop. Does anybody remember The Body Shop? Like back in the day. So I worked for The Body Shops like in the early 90s. And there was a woman named Anita Roddick who was the founder of the company. Does anybody remember Anita Roddick? But you should check her out. There's a Harvard Business School story about Anita. So she was, I don't know, maybe diverging, so I'll try to stay on track here. But I don't know, it's important to tell the story today. Anita was the first woman I ever saw who had created a company. So she was a founder of a company. And I had just like finished grad school. I didn't know what I was going to do with my life, but I fell in love with this company, and I fell in love with this woman, like truly, as a leader. And she was just full on like herself, but she was like the first person that I knew who did like no animal testing, things we take for granted, fair trade, different things that were really attractive to me. but the Body Shop had a very unique culture. And so I think like it was very formative for me to be able to see like, wow, this is what a company that can be created, and like what culture meant is like how you're going to engage with each other. And so I do think it evolves, but I don't want to like pick a fight with the panel, but I think that it is core. I think the person from Sun River, is it Stacy, said that like there's something very deep in a company. And I think it's reflective of what you do externally. So at the Body Shop, there was an internal culture that was about how people were going to interact with each other. But because it was a consumer business, it was also about how people were going to interact with the customer. And so I think there's a real symbiotic relationship. So what's internal is also external. And so that was the same at Starbucks. Like we used to talk about one person, one cup of coffee at a time. So we weren't in the coffee business, we were in the people business serving coffee. And so again, like how people were treated in the four walls was shown up how people were treated when they came into or inside of the company. The same thing, and they're all different. Like Lululemon, very much a company that was founded on helping people become like their best selves, like through yoga pants or through the Lululemon Groove Pant. And so that, I think those were things that I really learned, was just that, one, it was fundamental in terms of how people are treated, and that two, it's a reflection of how you interact with other people in the world. And the other thing I think too is that I think cultures are bespoke. There is no, this is going to sound, I don't know, I'm thinking as I say this, like everything I'm thinking as I say it, so that's dangerous, but also maybe exciting. We're on the verge. But I think that you should know who you are with the culture. I don't think you should be trying to pretend something that you're not. So I say that by saying, like, I do think there are cultures that are less, I guess, ethical, from my opinion. But I also think you shouldn't put out there that you're like a nice culture or a culture of, whatever, happiness, if you're not. And I don't mean that to say that you're like a culture of evil. But I mean to say, like, if you're a high performance culture that says, like, look, you better perform or you're not going to stay around, then you should be honest about that. Because if you pretend, it's just going to be like a disingenuous thing. And then people won't be successful. Right?
That's so important.
Yeah.
That's so important. I feel like that's got to be so relevant to so many people who are looking to bring people on. And there's this very loud conversation around culture. And so how do you build a culture? Mm-hmm. And I think it's very interesting that you brought up a story from way back when. It's still influencing who you are today and affecting how you work and how you interact with people. That's it. You're building, you're growing, you're evolving over time.
Well, it affected my life. And I think that's, I feel like I'm looking at you, but I'm also looking at people. Sorry.
They're really nice.
I know.
You can look at them. They're great.
You're great to look at, but I'm also like, I want to talk to you too. But I think companies have a real opportunity to do good for the world. So I think you're employing a lot of people, right? It's important. You're making money, you're providing a service, and it's a place where people are going to spend a lot of their time. Right? We spend a lot of time at work. That hasn't changed. And I'm hearing people are spending more time or they're being asked more of them. And so I think in that realm, like, you have such an opportunity to be able to create something bigger that will impact people. Like, every job I've had has impacted me.
I was just going to say,
for better or for worse. I've been lucky. I think I've had a really good run. But I think that we all have the jobs and the bosses that we talk about. I remember I had a boss who said, you never want to be the boss that people talk about at home. If you hear that name too many times, it's probably not a good thing for the most part, or it could be a really great thing. But I think we have an opportunity to really do good. And I think culture is reflective of performance. I think that's been proven over time.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that this is a really important point. Like, yes, we spend a lot of time at our jobs, but also there is an opportunity to grow and to change, and for better, for worse, that does happen. So it would make sense that we would take the opportunity to really provide an environment for our people to develop themselves. So I'm wondering what your kind of perfect recipe or even imperfect recipe for culture is. Like, what are the things that you've seen that really work and maybe don't work so much? And I know you said it's bespoke, so across the board examples.
Yeah, I guess, it's bespoke in terms of like what the outcome is, but I think there are some very specific ingredients. So I think like every company I've worked for had a vision for what the culture should be. So I do think it can happen organically, but I think being intentional about it over time is probably what allows you to scale. So just, I think you're going to have a culture whether you intentionally create one or not. You just want to make sure that it's the one that you actually want it to be. And so I think creating a vision, one of the things I often will advise people to do is just to sit back and really dream, vision of what you want it to be. So like, how do you want, 5 years from now, like, how do you want people to be talking about your company? What are the conversations that you want people to be having? What do the meetings look like? What does the building look like, if there is a building, or maybe there isn't a building? And I think it really starts with that. And I think, especially if you're like a founder of a company or a CEO, I think you have a profound impact on what that's going to be. So all the companies I've been in, Howard Schultz at Starbucks, Anita at The Body Shop, Chip Wilson at Lululemon, Katrina Lake at Stitch Fix, they all had a very specific vision for the company that they wanted to create, not just for the product, but for the people. And so I think it really starts with that. What do you want to really be doing? And what is the workplace really going to be looking like? And it's funny, as I'm saying this, culture is in families. Culture is on sports teams. I know it's not popular to talk about sports teams, but I love sports. I'm a Warriors fan. Go Warriors. I don't know. Don't boo me here, but if you're a Celtics fan, I'm sorry. But I think that, that's it. It's kind of like, how are we going to operate? And so what is your vision for that? And so I think that is one of the things I've seen at every company. And then I think it's translating vision into like very tangible things. So it's like, what are your values? What do you stand for? And being very, very specific about that. I think once you have a framework like that, then you can make lots of decisions. Again, I think it was Stacy who talked about that, which is the we care. If that we care is up on the wall and you're trying to decide, like, how are you going to pay people? Or what are the benefits going to be? Or how are you going to lay people off? And how are you going to tell people? That will be so helpful. I think I was telling you the story when I was at Stitch Fix. We had warehouses, and warehouses can be really, really hot. And it's really, really expensive to actually put air conditioning in. And I remember we had one in Texas, and it was really, really hot. And people were really struggling in there, and it would have cost, I think it was $1 million to put air conditioning into that warehouse. And we had to really make a decision, and I remember the CFO and I were sitting there, and we had a value of integrity, and we were like, okay, let's look at integrity when it comes to a warehouse. And it was really interesting because we had people who worked in an office. And so then we had people who worked in warehouses. And so if you have a divide about how people are being treated in different parts of your company, so it's like your back of the house staff or you have your front of the house staff, that's an integrity issue. And so that, I think, is really where it came up for us, is like we had to put the air conditioning in. And we had to figure out, where's the $1 million going to come from? And we know that $1 million just doesn't grow on trees. So those are really, really big and really hard decisions. But those are things that are really core to me and why I've always worked for those companies, because I think the frontline worker is really important. My parents were frontline workers. They were blue-collar workers. And so I grew up in a family that had unions and that went on strike. And so I think like early on for me, it was just something that I really saw as being like a really important thing to do, in operating from your values and how you treat people and just being really consistent. So I think values, then, that is another very, very fundamental piece of building culture. And I think that's where you have to ask yourself is, do they change over time? Or are they always like right there? Because sometimes culture, what we call culture, is just the expression of culture. And those things can be the things that change, or it may be different in different offices that you have, right? It may look different in a warehouse, but it's still fundamentally the actual culture. I remember somebody told me, I think they call it this at Walmart, they talk about the difference between culture and traditions. So culture could be those deep embedded values, but the traditions are like, hey, in this particular area, we go out to baseball games, or over here, we actually do barbecues on Friday, or we buy pizza or whatever. Those could be the expressions of it, but then there's that really deep core is what the values are.
I appreciate that so much. So how were you had like 3 major corporate experiences. I know there have been more than that, but the 3 that you mentioned, Lululemon, Starbucks, and Stitch Fix, how were culture, like differences between the 3? What really stood out for you?
That's a really good question. I've worked a long time, so I have a lot of experiences to remember. I remember, like, one thing I thought was funny to me when I think back on it now, when I was working at the Body Shop, it was like a very hippie culture. Like, I worked there, I probably shouldn't tell this because somebody might come after me, but when I worked there, I just remembered this morning. I wanted so badly to work in the head office. Like, it was my dream. I wanted to work in training and development. And I kept like doing everything I could to get into that. I was like an hourly salesperson, and I was like, I just want to do training and development at the Body Shop. And I finally got the job offer, and they offered it to me, and it was in Toronto, but they said, we can't do a visa for you. So I used to cross the border illegally for this job. Like, you know, and it was like, but it was like that kind of like free and easy, like take your chances, you know, kind of company. But I loved it. I mean, and that showed up in incredible ways. You know, we would put stuff in our window, like, you know, posters and like creative stuff that like people would be rioting, not rioting, but protesting against, you know, and I just loved it. So the culture there was like edgy. And so I remember when I was thinking about Starbucks, going to Starbucks, I was like, this place is way too controlled. They timed everything. Like a shot, you know, like was timed, like whatever it was. You know, it was like an X amount of like seconds or minutes. It was precision. And I was like, I don't want to work at that place. You know, I got a job offer, and I actually declined it because I was like, that place is too uptight. Too uptight. Well, I mean, this is a great story to remember too. Like, I think it's great. But so the person who I declined, it was the HR director, Glenna Hecht. I remember her name. Glenna pretended, I wrote her a letter. I mean, this was like way back in the day. I wrote her a letter and said like, sorry, I can't take this job. And she pretended not to get it. She just called me and she was like, so anyway. And then I was like, I mean, I wasn't that young, but I was young in my career, and I was like, okay, I guess I'll take the job. And I didn't even drink coffee. That's another secret. I drank tea. So I love your tea. But anyway, I drank tea. And so anyway, but the culture at Starbucks was very reflective of that. You know, it was like it took very, very great pride in all those very specific things. And I know things have evolved. You know, I don't want to claim like, you know, I left Starbucks, I think, in 2010. And I know companies evolve. But the culture there was very predicated on Howard Schultz, whose dad was a blue-collar worker who had, I remember, gotten injured and like didn't have insurance, and that was why Howard introduced insurance for hourly employees, which now I think is kind of taken for granted, but at the time was like a really big deal. So it was that kind of sense of caring for employees. I wouldn't go as far to say it was like a family, but there was a sense of like granting beanstalk, which was, you know, stock options, that it was more than just like you're just, you know, signing up for a barista job. And now, I mean, I think it's really interesting because you and I were talking about this. Howard has come back as CEO for like the second time, and he's come back largely because the stores are trying to unionize. And there's been like a break between, at least as far as I see it, I'm not an insider, but you can read about it, which is a trust has been broken over the time through the pandemic between leadership and the employees. And so that's, again, like how a culture evolves. We'll see how that turns out. But I think Howard is out there. I just read an article about it. He's really out there trying to, you know, say to people they don't need that. You know, and I'm not commenting on whether that's true or not, but I think it's a reflection of the culture. Like, that's personal for him. Lululemon, I mean, Chip Wilson had a vision for what that company would be. Like, there weren't yoga pants for women, right? That's another thing we take for granted. It was all, you know, women wearing Nike, and so there was this element of like, we can create performance, or they could create performance clothes for people, which really connected to setting vision and goals. So every employee at Lululemon was taught how to set a vision and goals for their life, and they were applauded when they left. So when people actually left the company in our head office, they were clapped out. Because it was like, oh, you're actually achieving your vision and goal. So it wasn't like hold on to people at all costs. It was like, let them go, you know, let them do their thing. And I think that's one thing. I know that's really hard, especially now during hiring crunches. But there's something about being able to let people develop and leave, because they'll often come back. That was, you know, at Stitch Fix, we used to hire data scientists, and they're, you know, a hot commodity. And they could get paid way more at Google and Netflix than they could get paid at Stitch Fix. They came for the culture because they were able to do kind of end-to-end development and have a flat organizational structure, which they weren't able to have in those companies. But at a point, they were like, I want to work there. I want to make more money. And we would say, great, go do it. And many of those people came back. And so there is that element of like, don't try to hold on to people, I guess, before, you know, beyond their time. Or even yourself. I mean, I know I've moved on companies when I knew it was like my time to go. And so I think those are things to think about. I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah,
about
it's
cultures.
fantastic.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm meandering.
Oh,
Sorry.
no, that was right on.
I ate dessert first, which maybe the sugar is like kicked in. It was really good.
Can we get another round of chicken breast,
I had
please?
the chocolate. It was great. I asked my neighbor, I said, is this bad if I eat dessert first? And she said, go for it.
She was like, just watch the timing on your interview because it could take a left.
Exactly.
I think it's really interesting to talk about this link like this. What's the perfect ratio? I don't think there is one, but what's the perfect ratio of culture coming from the founder versus culture coming from the team? And the founders that you're talking about, these are not perfect people.
No.
And over time, that also manifests and comes out in all these different ways. So talk about that a little bit. I think it's very fascinating.
It's a really good question. I mean, I think it's collaborative. You know, I think in every company, and all of those companies, it was collaborative. I think at the beginning, you know, I think at Starbucks, it was created, you know, by the employees. Like at Stitch Fix, we went around and excavated the culture, you know, from people. I mean, that's, I think, where it comes up from employees, where we would say, like, what are you noticing? You know, I remember when I started there, I interviewed people because we wanted to codify the culture. It was there. Like, what's a great leader? What's a great manager? What do you see in meetings where people are really, you know, showing up in the way you want them to show up? And you extract those things, and that's where you kind of go like, oh, this is what's happening. That's what's happening. That's integrity, or that's partnership, or that's collaboration, or that's kindness. And so I think that it's kind of a symbiotic thing. But what I think can be dangerous is that when you change a leader, then you think the culture is going to change. I think that creates like a real, like, what am I going to call it? Like, it's confusing for people, right? Like, so when like a new CEO comes into the company, I think it's natural that there would be some changes, but then it's like, we're going to change the whole thing. Yeah. And then I think it's hard to operate. And so I think it's a real balance to that. Like I think there's a reverence and a respect for the culture, but don't hold it too tightly. So I'm trying to think of an example where it changed. I think at Stitch Fix, an example I'll give is we realized, well, two things we realized is when we had a problem one time, we had a problem getting work done. So we recognized, like, we had this really high growth company that was doing really well, and all of a sudden everything was slow as molasses. We were hearing people complaining about meetings, we couldn't get work done, and this is like a pace, you know, that you want to keep up in innovation. And we went out, we talked to people and did focus groups. We were like, what's wrong? And what we found out was that people misinterpreted a value that was partnership. And they began to think it was consensus. So instead of partnership meant like, I'm a data scientist, you're a merchant. We're going to come together and blend art and science. And sometimes I get to decide and sometimes you get to decide. But what happened was people were sitting in meetings trying to grind it out, where you and I would be trying to be like, well, what's the answer that kind of solves for both of us? And it was just, we were stuck. And then the answers were like some kind of Frankenstein, you know, mixture of things that weren't good for anybody, right? They weren't good for the customer. They weren't good for people. And so what we realized was that people were misunderstanding a value. And so I think those are the times when you have to also step back and say, like, whoa, we actually have a set of values, but somehow it's drifted over time. And so I think a lot of times when I see that with companies, it's either the values haven't been defined or they've drifted. And then it's like a sense of having to come back to it. I think there's also a sense, too, of like every choice you make about a value has a dark side. So I'm just going to say the one kindness, which I think is a good value. But if you have kindness, sometimes you can be too nice. And then you don't actually tell people the truth. You could mistake what kindness is, when in fact kindness is actually me being direct with you and kind. Yes. If I need to give you feedback. So I think, you know, they all have their choices. Like, it's just like partnership can become overly consensitized. I think at Starbucks it was respect and dignity. So we had a value of respect and dignity, and then what we were finding out was people were complaining, like, if they got feedback from their manager. And, you know, saying, like, you need to show up to work on time or something like that. And people would be like, that's not respect and dignity. And we'd be like, no, it actually is. You know, like, we're trying to run a company, and, you know, we're saying it in a respectful way. So I think those are the times, I guess, when you need to look at, like, go back to the roots of the company and actually look at what needs to change. And then I think at Stitch Fix, I remember we added a value because we realized there was one we were actually evaluating people on that we actually hadn't told them. So it was authenticity, because we'd be like, well, this person, you know, very authentic, and this person not authentic. And then we looked in our values and we're like, we don't actually have a value of authenticity. But then we had to decide what it was, because that's a word, like, sometimes I feel like I go in a million directions with this, right? We could talk for 3 hours, but what does that actually mean? What does that mean to you and to the company? Because it could be like very fuzzy.
Yeah, certainly many of these words are overused and are kind of like hot buzzwords right now. And I think it's interesting to see, like, we know what it looks like when someone's really doing the work. This came up in the panel before. Like, we know what it looks like when someone's doing the work, and we know what happens when people are just sort of pretending to do the work. And I think that what this last couple of years has showed us has been this great reveal, right? Like, now it's all out in the open.
Right. Yeah, we were talking about that earlier. Yeah, it feels like during the pandemic, I mean, the pandemic's a crucible, right? I mean, I was quoting to you my trainer, Judy, who's very wise. You know, Judy's like, we're not coming out of this for a while. Like, I think, you know, hopefully we come out of it from like a business perspective. But I think personally, I think that's one thing where I think we've been impacted. Wherever you are in the equation of whatever business is or your personal beliefs, this has not been a small thing. And so I think you couple that where it's just been this crucible of like how people have been treated during the pandemic, like as a worker, what are the decisions that have been made? You couple that in a very intense emotional experience and like a never experienced before for most people, right, in their lifetime with social media, where like everything you do inside of a company is available to be known outside of a company, right? And we were talking about some examples of, I don't think they're necessarily bad companies, right? Difficult things happen to companies that are good. That's the other thing is like, I wouldn't hold yourself as being like so, you know, perfect that things aren't gonna happen that are really challenging, or you're gonna have decisions that are gonna feel like they're really not good decisions. I'm sorry, I'm going to diverge one other point, but there's an interesting one with Starbucks right now, which is they had a policy of opening their bathrooms to everyone, you know, which makes sense. But then now the staff is being in a really dangerous, you know, feels like they're in a dangerous potential situation because the bathrooms are open to everybody. Like these are the kind of decisions that come up in a company. But back to what you're saying, so during the pandemic, things came out like Everlane, you know, all of a sudden people were like, you know, saying, hey, there's a dissonance between what the company is saying maybe externally with Black Lives Matter than what's actually happening inside the company. Those were a lot of moments of truth for companies. And it's really, how do you react to those things? Like, what do you actually do when those things come up? Because things like that are going to come up. You aren't always going to be operating the way you want to, or there'll be people who maybe you have a value and they're not operating that way, but you're responsible for those people that are inside of your company. So I think that's going to happen, and I think the things that have happened and in many ways are good. I think employees have more power now than they ever have before, which I think is good. And I think, because I think we're employees, right? And so I think sometimes when we complain about like, why does everybody want to know what they're going to get paid? I think, well, wouldn't you have wanted to know when you were like 25 years old what you were going to get paid? I mean, transparently, right? And not get underpaid. And so I think that that's a good thing. I just do think, as people have shared, it causes us to have to operate differently. So there, you know, I think transparency is another word that's kind of thrown around, but I do think like you have to assume that every memo you send in the company, every single thing you do is potentially going to be plastered out there on the New York Times or on Twitter. Yeah. And that's not a reason to change what you do, but be thoughtful. Like I used to always think about compensation is such a hot topic. It's emotional for people. You know, I'm in HR, I've never been able to easily talk about it myself, about my own compensation. Yeah. But I remember like every decision we made about compensation, is particularly at Stitch Fix, because it was, you know, going from private company to public company with stock options, is if you couldn't talk about it in front of a whole group of people, like this many people or more, and feel comfortable about the decision, then you probably shouldn't be doing it. Right? I know that's
a big deal.
That's sweaty, right?
Yeah,
when
it's
you think
sweaty.
about that.
Sweaty, exactly.
But imagine,
like,
you know,
a little itchy.
It's a little itchy. It's a little sweaty, like, you know.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're going to open it up to questions from the crowd in a moment, but I want to stick with this for just this is like really interesting stuff to me. So, how do we there are some real realities people need to take a look at. And as you said in one of our prior conversations, like some people will and some people won't, but like this question around like how the workforce has changed, like you can have a thought about it, or you can actually really figure out what's going on. And I'm just wondering if you have any kind of thoughts on like the evolution of us as workers and employers and CEOs and like are you going to fight it, or are you going to
it's a great
resist
question.
against it? Or
I mean,
what happens when we resist,
I know. Well, it's like life. What happens when you resist?
You get a sore neck.
I keep hearing people telling to surrender, like we talk about, we have practices of meditation, or we go to therapy or whatever, and people are like, surrender, love what is. And it's like, that's hard. What if I don't love what is right now? It's not fun. Life can be challenging. So it just feels like you have to soul search on that as a company. And I also think you have to be practical about what you can do. And be honest about that. So it's like, what can you pay people? These are real things right now. And, how can you develop people? How can you actually care about people? I feel like, one of the things that I've been talking about a lot or thinking about a lot, which is, I think we're looking for new answers. And I think there are there are interesting and new answers. Like I think, flexible work, remote. I don't think, I know for some people, like they have to go back. Like if you work in a restaurant, like you can't do that job virtually. But I think that, for people who have been able to work remote, I think it's going to be really hard for people to give that up, and I think that's a reality that we now need to think about, what
introverted people.
Yes. Introverted people, or like it gives flexibility, right, for
like
people.
Nobody talked about the introverts prior to this whole thing, and now like introverts are getting their day.
That's right.
I'm with it.
Exactly. But I think I do keep coming back to this thing that I think the essentials are there in terms of like, what do you do? I think you treat people well. I think you care about people. Like, I think, I always ask people, like, think back to the jobs that you liked. Like, we've all had jobs. What are the jobs you liked? Did you like the job when the boss was a jerk? I didn't. And I don't, I'm going to say too, I want to think the best of people. Like, I say that lightly, kind of funny, but I don't think anybody probably starts out wanting to be a jerk. They just didn't have the training, or maybe, I don't know. Don't think that, but maybe they didn't have the training, or they had a bad boss, or like it's the legacy of all these things. But I think if you put yourself in that situation, you go like, what are the essentials here that we're talking about? And I think it goes a long way. I do think people, that people have a lot of choices today, and they could go work at places for more money, and they could do a lot of different things, and maybe they will. But I do think fundamentally the same things are the same. Is it like, are you caring actually about a person as a human being? Are you fair as can be, whatever that means? Are you, like honest and direct with people? Do they know where they stand? Are they compensated fairly for the work that they're doing? And do they know what it's going to be? Like if it's going to be a job where you're working like night and day, like tell people that, And so I honestly, I feel like maybe it's a boring answer, but I feel like the answer of like what today is probably like going back to the basics. Yeah. Because I also think the pandemic has caused people to really evaluate their whole life, like what's important to them. And I think that's impacting how people feel about the work that they're doing too. Absolutely. As much as they're able, because, sometimes people don't have a lot of choice.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. But if your strategy is at the expense of your employees, it's time to probably go back to the drawing board with your business plan.
Yeah. And it's a free will planet. Right. Like I think, you make your choice, right? We all get to make our choice about what seems like it's the correct choice for you. I'm all about supporting that for people. And then you're going to see what happens. And then you adjust, right? If you make a choice and say, okay, we're going down this path, we're going to stick, maybe it's like we're going to stick to what we do and we're not making a change right now. Great. And then you see what happens. You then make a different decision because you'll know.
Oh yeah. It'll come right up and look you right in the face.
Look you right in the eye, like we're looking at each other right now.
Right in the eye. Okay, so I know you're open to some questions.
I love questions. They're good.
Do we have anybody? We have 4 microphones, but you can say it and I'll repeat your question.
Around. Oh, good.
Thank you. Culture is essential. Healthy culture is priceless.
Mm-hmm. In like 1 or 2 words, what potentially could harm that, or how do we prevent a culture being destroyed?
Oh, in 1 or 2 words. Margo, if anyone can do it.
Be vigilant. So be vigilant.
Yeah. Come on.
Does that make sense? Like, I'll be like a little bit like not too wordy. Watch out. Like, if you don't let somebody go who's not, I don't want to be like fire them immediately, but like if you're not actively addressing the culture or reinforcing the culture, people are going to be like the thing they say. It's a sign on the wall.
Yeah.
It's words in a conference room. I think you have to be really, really rigorous, and that is not always easy. I remember Justine, who I worked with at Stitch Fix, she used to say, it's about doing what's right, not what's easy. Yeah.
Use your eyes, use your ears, and
be vigilant.
rely on your people, right?
Yeah. Be vigilant.
Okay,
Yeah,
microphones are flying. Where am I going next? Microphones are, but yes, back in the corner, right behind you.
Hello.
This looks like it's going to be a good one, Margo. I
can
feel good
feel
about this
it
question.
coming. Okay, good. All the way in the back of the room. This is a good one.
He shot up.
No pressure, right?
I know, no pressure.
If you was to walk into a company tomorrow that had a failing culture, what is the first few steps you would take to address and fix it?
Ooh, that's a great question.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for asking it.
You did it.
Yeah, you did
Well
it.
done.
I've been
Nailed
thinking
it.
for a few minutes.
Nailed it. I'd want to find out why. I guess, and this is maybe too personal, but I was recently diagnosed with OCD, and I have a therapist who I work with who works specifically with OCD. And, when you have, your brain works that way, it always wants to try to analyze and find out why about things, because it's really about control. That's a whole other story. That's why surrender is hard. But, he always says to me, Dr. Dan says, you never want to answer any question that begins with why, because there's no good end to that. Like, you just keep going with it. But I do say in that situation, I'd really honestly want to find out why, because I think sometimes we address symptoms versus like the real diagnosis. So I'd really want to understand like what's happening. Let's get in there and really start to understand why. So how do we know it's failing, right? Because then that helps us understand, like, oh, is it a value that's gone off the rails? Or is it like a specific group? I did this talk with grocers, the California Association of Grocers, which was super interesting. And like they talked about the meat department, which was really interesting. Like in many of their grocery stores, things would go wrong in the meat department. I know that sounds funny, but I was like, what the heck,
That feels right, actually.
I know, because there were like one person said it, and then there were three other people in the room who were like, my meat department is challenging too.
I got beef.
And so it was like they had a beef in the meat department. But I don't know why it was that. But, I say that in all seriousness to say, like, maybe it's a part of the company that there's something that's gone wrong. Like, maybe it's a specific manager, like leadership. I think you have to look at everything and just be really honest about it, and just be okay with it that it's gone wrong. I think where it could also trip you up is like that feeling of like shame about it. I think you should take it seriously, but I think what you want to do is be able to be like, okay, and be honest about it. I think that would be another thing I would probably say to the staff, the employees, is to be like, I feel like our culture is gone, off the rails here, or it's not what we wanted it to be. And we want to really talk about that.
I love this, and I know that you are all about personal development. I know you just went on like a big extended vision quest, and you're very much, you're talking about skillfulness is what you're talking about, right? And like a skill is like you identify a skill, you find out where you can get it, you learn the skill, you practice the skill, rinse and repeat, here we go. So like, how do people learn how to be better at being honest and communicating with honesty and staying in the room when it's hard? Like, how do people learn how to do this?
Margo Downs. Learn how to be honest through trial and error, probably. I mean, it is one of those things like you learn by experience, I think, right? Like there are skills that you can learn, like you can go to the communication class or read the nonviolent communication book, but like the way we learn to be honest is like, by getting feedback on how that's going. Like when I'm not honest, right? You ever have those moments, where you're like, I was not totally honest about that. And then maybe sometimes you don't have to be totally honest. Like, it's not like a lie, but it's like, is it the right time for that? I often think about that. Like, I don't go into all these situations, but sometimes people think they're like, I'm going to be honest. And it's like bad timing. Right? Not the time for that. Is it kind? Is it necessary?
Yeah, close that bathrobe.
Close that, like the bathrobe. Just not a good moment for that, you know? But anyway, I mean, I think I do. I mean, I'm not saying, I mean, I think you can go to, you know, development, but I think things like honesty and stuff like that, that comes from experience, right?
Yeah.
I don't know. Does the audience
Yeah.
think that? What do you guys think? Yeah? Okay.
You know, we have a mix of people, some honest, some not. That's cool. You're not on trial. Okay, what's my next question? Where's my next question?
Come on.
Oh, yes.
Erin.
Can I ask a question?
Absolutely.
I've earned it.
Hi, Erin. She's worked really hard. She's worked so hard.
My favorite person in Central Oregon.
And she's been my chaperone all weekend in Bend. So I haven't had a chance to get to all of Central Oregon, but I've had a really great weekend in Bend. And
Got a
Erin
good
gave me-
sampler platter.
What's that?
A good sampler
A good
platter.
sampler in Bend. So Erin has been the person who has been like, where do I go to eat? What do I do? So Erin, you've earned a
Not
question.
why I took the microphone, but thank you very much. I'm curious, there's a lot of women on stage today. Is that a coincidence? Is that normal? Is that... I didn't do it on purpose, necessarily, but I'm
It's just-
curious if that is a theme in this line of work.
In the work of culture work? That's a really good question. I think there are a lot of women that are in the human resources field. I think there are more men that are coming online to that. I think that, yeah, I mean, I hope the world is becoming a place where everyone is getting a chance to be able to be on the stage.
To do what they're actually
To
good
do
at.
what they're actually here to do, you know, whether that's like women or men. And I think, yeah, I think there are groups of people who haven't perhaps had that opportunity or maybe haven't themselves felt the confidence because of the experiences to be able to get on the stage. I mean, I respect everybody who gets on the stage and everybody who doesn't get on the stage, but it's, you know, when you put yourself on the stage, you're putting yourself out there, right? To be able to say like, okay, you know, here I am.
Here I am.
Yeah,
Love me or leave me.
that's right.
Well, and has the story changed around some of these types of roles? Is that evolving, I guess, is part of the question?
I hope it does. I mean, that's a whole other topic about HR. I mean, HR gets a really bad rap. I didn't want to go into it when I was in learning development, which I was like, I loved. It was about developing people. It was great. And my boss wanted me to get in HR. And I was like, that's all about firing people. It's about lawyers. I want nothing to do with that. Right? I was like, there's no way. And then I learned that, you know, that's another thing I learned, you know, it was like in the back of my mind, but I learned that like that's where it could come about, was about thinking about organizations and culture. So I was fortunate to have mentors who showed me that. And so I hope over time people are beginning to see, and I think the panel like showed that as well, is I hope people are beginning to see like there's great work in this. It's not admin. It's actually like a very strategic and valuable function, and that it's a great career path for a lot of different people. Yeah.
I love that. Okay, well, and I have anybody else
More challenging
shooting
questions,
out of their
please.
seat,
About
bursting with the
anything.
question for yes. Okay, we need a microphone for this. Well, I'll just repeat it. Oh, he's coming. He's coming.
Oh, he's coming. Don't yell. Don't strain your voice.
So don't yell into the mic. Got it. So we're in this kind of time period where Gen Z and millennials are taking over as like the predominant people in the workforce. The number of leaders, or like the leaders in most workforces though, are from older generations. And so we're kind of in this weird transition period where now as culture is building and changing, we've also got these huge generational gaps where there's either differences in communication or there's these terms like work ethic that mean totally different things to people that come from like different generations. So as you think about how a company is evolving and their culture is changing over time and this workforce demographic is changing, what advice might you give to a company owner or a leadership team, and how to deal with that? How do you handle that?
That's my favorite question.
Such a good question. I'll be a contrarian here. I don't know which generation I am really at this point, but I sometimes worry that too much is made of generational gaps, because I think it's prone to stereotyping. So just like it would be a stereotyping if I said all men are like this and all women are like that and all, you know, pick your race or whatever you want to pick are like that, then I think if you say like all millennials are like this or all, you know, whatever, 18-year-olds are like this, I think it's dangerous. Because I think there are definitely influences, right? You know, I think maybe people like to text more now than make a phone call. You know, I remember I was talking about this. I was speaking at the National Association of Home Builders, and there was an architect who owned her home firm. She's like, I'm so frustrated. I want people to send emails, but they're sending texts. And it's like, okay, let's really think about that in terms of like, can the same thing be achieved in a text as an email? You know, and if it can't with a client, then we need to talk about it. But if it's just like, again, it's like a tradition versus a culture. If our culture is good communication and we can do that by text, then I like to get text more than a phone. Like, voicemail is like, what? You know, and I'm like 61 years old. So I've changed, you know, like I would like think about a voicemail to me or somebody actually calling me on the phone. I'm like, what's that? You know? And so I do think there's an influence. And so I really think it's about like, let's deal with people like as they are, and let's watch trends, you know, so that we don't become outmoded and outdated. But like, I worked with Katrina Lake at Stitch Fix. She started the company when she was in her late 20s. That's hard. And she always jokes and says it was her first real job. And she created a company, like a great company. And so like that to me kind of blew that. And she taught me stuff. Like, I didn't know about leadership and that, you know, so there's like so much possibility, I think, if we stay open. And so that, I guess that would be, you know, your question is like, what advice would I give, is to stay open, to look for things that are trends that maybe need to change or maybe don't, if they're not effective, but also allow people the freedom to be seen as they are and not necessarily lumped in. Because I also think there's probably some trends where people are going back to older perspectives. Like I've seen, you know, a lot of people are going back to crafts and artisan. Like a lot of people are going back to the trades because they've become disenchanted with maybe technology work and want work that's more hands-on. You know, so there's like really different things, like artisan. If you think about things that are like craft beers and people are creating, like that's kind of going back to something that was maybe before. And so I think there's a lot of complexity, I think, in terms of thinking about people, in terms of their age. And so yeah, I guess that's what I would say. Does that make sense or satisfying answer? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I love that question is being asked.
Yeah, I do too.
I think that's really an important part of it. Yeah.
Yeah, but you know, I just think it's just be careful, you know, about saying all these are like that.
Watch yourself.
I don't think so. I think he's watching. I think you asked a question, so I think he's okay. You know.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Oh,
make it hard.
Right here. I got a hard one.
Yeah.
Can we extend the question to the culture question to culture? So many of my clients are working with offshore companies and with a mix of cultures.
Yeah.
So can you speak to the integration of multiple cultures?
fantastic question.
Wow, that's such a good
We're going to
question.
need about a whole weekend
know.
conference,
Yeah.
Margo.
I know, it's a really good question. Again, I think the answer is like sensitivity. You know, I think that, and this comes to my mind, is a couple examples from Starbucks. That I remember that when Starbucks opened in China, there's a practice in China that like if somebody breaks something in a store, they would be, you know, penalized in their pay. So it would be taken out of their pay, like if an employee like dropped a mug or something like that. And that was not a Starbucks cultural thing. Like we just wouldn't do that, like if that happened in a store. And so that was one of the situations where we had to navigate, like what is a practice that is culturally aligned, but is not culturally aligned with the company's values. And that's a tough decision. And I remember like in, you know, countries where like men and women, you know, were kept separately, you know, those were other things that came up, which is like what's of value in the company and then what's being respectful for how the culture is made. So I think you have to look at where do those things like have a rub? And then I think it's a decision that you're going to have to make about how you're going to operate. And so I think there's sensitivity, like there are always those kind of things. Like I think in interviews, I can remember having training where it's like certain cultures, like it's not acceptable to like look someone in the eye. And then people are judged for not looking someone in the eye. And so I think then that's where it gets back to integrity about how you're assessing people and how you're interacting with people. And so just again, to be very aware of what is the operating and be curious. You know, I don't think we talked a lot about the word of curiosity, which I think, you know, it just isn't, you can't emphasize enough to be curious about it so that you can learn. You know, it's like you're talking about offshore companies. It's like, well, if you're going to make a decision that you're going to actually work with an offshore company, it shouldn't be like a throwaway decision, right? Which is like, okay, this is just financially, you know, what we're going to do. We're not actually going to think about, like what we were talking earlier about, well, what's the relationship between the headquarters of the company and the offshore company? Are we just discarding our culture in terms of how we work with those folks, or how are we actually going to really think about that holistically? So I think, you know, again, it's curiosity, it's sensitivity, and I think sometimes it's going to be decisions that are challenging, like the decisions I talked about with Starbucks, and where you're going to need to talk about those with people and really seek to understand, but also seek to have a communication and a dialogue with people so they will understand.
Yeah, I think it bears mentioning too that curiosity, you could treat it as a skill, right? It's not just something like some people have and some people don't have. Like curiosity is a thing that you can cultivate.
Yeah, I think you can. You know, I think you can really challenge yourself. Again, it gets back to the why question.
Mm-hmm.
You know, what is the technique is the 5 whys, you know, which is, it's all about like root cause. I think that's done in like lean manufacturing or like 6 Sigma is like get to the root of it. Like, you know, because superficial assessments, like I am wrong. I have been wrong so many times about people. Like I realize this now. I was telling you I went through a coaching program like over from 2020 to 2021, which was amazing. And I realized like my initial assessment of people that I thought was like right, it was wrong.
Yeah.
Because people are complex. And so 5 whys, you know, 5 whys with people or 5 whys with challenges, like it's really going to get you, contrary to what Dr. Dan says, but I do think like in the situation of root cause, it's going to be really helpful. Because what I've seen, and I've done this myself, is you waste time solving the wrong issue.
Yes.
So that's where curiosity comes in, where it's like if you keep kind of like, I'm always just like, well, why is that happening? Where people will be like, none of our executives have a sense of urgency. You know, I was talking to one of the CEOs I work with last week, and he's like, you know, he's been saying it for a while. They don't have the sense of urgency. And this last session we had, so I'm coaching him, and he said to me, you know what I realize? And I said, what? He said, I don't finish things that I start. He said, I get very excited at the beginning, and then he gets frustrated without getting the result, and then he said he stops. And he said, like, I realize it's actually showing up in me. What's showing up in me is showing up in the company. Like what I'm criticizing those people for is actually what I'm doing. Now that took like, I mean, maybe I'm not a good coach, but that took a while to figure out because it's complex, you know, and he figured it out.
Yeah.
Because I said to him one time, like, we just keep talking about this. Like, we have to figure this out. And, you know, he said, I have upon reflection, like, it starts with me. And so I think it was his curiosity of himself. And he even said, I'm like, well, what are we going to do? Like, what do you think we do? He said, I have to reflect on this and get more curious to understand in me where that's actually coming from. And so, I think curiosity can be learned. And it's like one of those life experiences, right? Where you come up against it and you're like, I think of myself, I'm like, why didn't I actually think about why that was happening, or why did I waste my time doing this when I should have, like, I learned it was actually that.
Well, right, because that thing that he discovered wasn't necessarily bad.
No.
It was just having an impact.
It's
a significant
great.
one. Yeah.
That's sometimes the thing about curiosity is like we'll find out things we don't want to know. What is it called? Pandora's box?
Yeah.
You know, like you open the box and then you're like, whoa, I didn't know that stuff was in there. But, you know, that is good ultimately.
Yeah.
It's not always fun, but it's, you know, ultimately could be very good.
Yeah. This has been magnificent. And I wonder if you have anything else that you want to add, any burning desires to share with us.
I would just say, just be compassionate with yourself. I really say that sincerely. I think, like, it's probably underrated. I think we generally, as humans, are hard on ourselves. And I would just say, like, just, you know, be compassionate. Because, you know, and practically, the more compassionate you are with yourself, the more you can actually show up for other people. And I don't think compassionate means, like, you know, I think we have a lot of, like, I have a high standard of being rigorous with myself, and I'm a high performer. That's great, you know. Then also be compassionate with yourself so that you can actually show compassion to other people. Right? We were talking about this in not the green room, but the boardroom before. You know, it's just we don't have a sense of what's going on with other people. You know, I think we don't know, and so I do think like that's part of our compassion with others. But I also think it's compassion with ourselves.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, tears came into my eye. My whole body broke out, and so that was really, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I love that you said for yourself, too, because it's the key. And I think when we're not being compassionate with others, that's an indication that we need to give ourselves compassion. I think that is a signpost.
Yeah, absolutely.
My
think
God,
so.
I have one follow-up question. Will
Yeah.
you marry me? Okay, too soon? Go ahead and email me your answer. Take your time. Round of applause from Margo Downs.